The situation in Iraq is unacceptable to the American people, and it is unacceptable to me.
A new year in Iraq, but as 2007 dawned, the shadow of its former leader loomed large. Saddam Hussein had been brought to the gallows just before dawn on December 30th, the first day of the religious holiday Eid al-Adha for Sunnis. To many, an affront by a Shia-led government. The affront would be compounded within days of the execution when footage taken by a mobile phone camera was leaked on the internet. Many of those who attended the hanging celebrated Saddam's final demise. The news pulled mid-prayer.
It was done in such a sectarian way. In many ways, it was street violence. It wasn't a government, when execution is usually much more clinical. I think it was a way, it was a statement. This guy was your symbol, and we killed him. So you should now surrender to us. We're in control.
The situation in Iraq was desperate. The insurgency was growing in strength. Attacks were bolder and deadlier. Iraqis were suffering from a lack of food, shelter, water, electricity, jobs, and above all, security. In Washington, the Bush administration was also desperate to come up with a new Iraq policy. The recently published findings of the Iraq Study Group actually called for a phased withdrawal, but the report was dismissed by George Bush. Nevertheless, he had to face mounting evidence of a failed policy and look for radical solutions. By January 2007, President George Bush publicly acknowledged that the violence in Iraq was spiraling out of control, at a time when the American public opinion stood firmly against the continued US presence in Iraq. He announced he had committed to more than 20,000 additional soldiers to be deployed in and around Baghdad. The House of Representatives voted against the surge. It was the first time in 4 years that Congress was decisively against the Iraq policy. Bush stood firmly too and vetoed the vote. And Bush remained defiant. On January 10th, he spelled out his new doctrine for Iraq and announced the much-anticipated troop escalation.
I've committed more than 20,000 additional American troops to Iraq.
It was a dramatic shift in US policy, one that some argue had been direly needed since the very beginning.
It was obvious we needed more troops. I mean, we'd never had enough troops in Iraq. We'd abandoned the first responsibility of an occupying power, which is to secure the country physically.
Well, it was so long in coming, I think, because simply the United States Army and the administration weren't prepared to admit that it was necessary.
But one officer had put his whole weight in backing the surge, General David Petraeus. In early January, he became the commander of the multinational forces in Iraq. The most significant change in policy, however, came from within Iraq itself, a local initiative which no one had anticipated.
Al-Qaeda has alienated people by its behavior. They have their own agenda, ideology, and way of operating. They were too extremist and accused anyone who disagreed with their ways of being infidel. The tribes and other resistance didn't accept their ways.
The rift started at the end of 2006, when Al-Qaeda announced the formation of the Islamic State in Iraq. Few supported this move, including the Sunni resistance groups.
They wanted to take us back to the time of the Caliphate. They started making new laws that had no relation with Islam and were taking us back to the Stone Age.
Most of the Iraqi groups refused the announcement of an Islamic State. We recognized that this could lead to the partition of Iraq.
The wave of popular uprising against Al-Qaeda and its Islamic State initiated in Ramadi, its stronghold in the Sunni Al-Anbar province. Tribes backed by Iraqi nationalist groups chased Al-Qaeda fighters from their towns and villages. Self-styled vigilante groups known as the Awakening Councils were formed to patrol and secure these areas. But Al-Qaeda fighters were relentless and simply moved their theater of operations to other areas. On February 3rd, over 140 people were killed by a truck bomb in a market in a Shia-dominated area of Baghdad. the blast brought down 10 buildings. Many of the victims were killed while sitting at home. By the time General Petraeus arrived in Baghdad on February 9th, Al-Qaeda fighters and Sunni armed groups were entangled in deadly turf wars on the outskirts of Baghdad and in the Diyala province northeast of the capital. And in Baghdad, Shia militias and Sunni groups were continuing their war for survival and supremacy.
When Bush invaded Iraq, Baghdad was probably half and half Sunni and Shia, maybe slightly more Shia. By January of 2007, it was 65% Shia. This equates to hundreds of thousands of Sunnis being chased from the city.
On February 14th, Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki announced the beginning of Operation Imposing Law, a new security crackdown for Baghdad. But with a Shia-dominated police and army, it was impossible to deploy them to Sunni areas, so Kurdish forces were called in.
We don't have the sectarian problem in Kurdistan, so we stand in the middle between Sunnis and Shias. We sent them 2 brigades. Many thought they would be biased, but they protected Sunnis from Shias and the Shias from the Sunnis whenever one came under attack.
For American soldiers, the biggest threat was no longer Sunni insurgents, but Iranian-backed Shia militias. The US administration became increasingly worried about the close ties some of its Iraqi allies had with Tehran.
Iran and the US in Iraq are a jealous girlfriend story. Iran's main client in Iraq is the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq, led by Abdel al-Hakim and his better corps paramilitary, who are allied with the Americans. So Iran and the United States have the same ally in Iraq. And this is very uncomfortable as a political reality, I think, for both regimes.
An example of Iran's alleged meddling was exposed during an intelligence briefing in Baghdad, where Iranian-made weapons, mortar shells, rocket-propelled grenades, and high-powered roadside bombs were put on display.
Been very clear and straightforward with them all along. With all the violations, interventions, we have been open with them. And the Iranian way of dealing with this, they always want to discuss it through commission, through mechanisms. They don't deny it. But in many occasions, really, we produce evidence, documents, photos, let's say, that we believe is emanating, sourcing from you.
Over time, it seemed that Iran wasn't limiting itself to attacks on US soldiers. There was strong suspicion it fueled the sectarian war in Baghdad by proxy.
The Badr organization is known to have engaged in reprisals against Sunnis. The campaign of ethnic cleansing of Sunni Arabs in Baghdad had to be planned out. It had to be coordinated, it had to be organized. And it's impossible to ethnically cleanse a city like Baghdad unless you plot it out. And there's some evidence that Iran may have had a role in this process. The Iranians are aware that whoever controls Baghdad controls a good deal of Iraq.
On March 10th, the Iraqi government held security talks with delegates from neighboring countries, the UN and the US. It was the first time Iran and the US sat at the same table in almost 3 decades.
Because there was 28 years of mistrust between them, and to bring them together to meet face to face was a huge challenge. But we did it also in stages. It didn't come all together. But of course, the message was really, you will gain nothing of extending our suffering or the instability in Iraq. If Iraq were to fail, the whole region will fail.
The new stringent security measures were making daily life in Baghdad even more difficult, but had little effect on the violence. By the end of March, civilian deaths had actually increased by a further 13% since the beginning of the crackdown.
We keep on staying home, afraid to go out, afraid to mix with people, afraid to live. So we are dead.
just as the surge troops were continuing to pour into the capital, calls for foreign soldiers to leave were multiplying. On April 9th, hundreds of thousands of Shias responded to the call of Muqtada al-Sadr and went to the streets demanding an end to the occupation. No other Iraqi had the power to mobilize so many people.
He represented the nationalist, Arab nationalist strain of the Iraqi Shia. He was in one sense exactly the sort of person that Western governments should have been trying to deal with as representing an independent and self-confident Iraq. But his attitude was anti-American, anti-occupation, and nobody ever managed to cope with that.
Others who also opposed the occupation continued to target the government. On April 12th, a suicide bomber struck at the heart of Iraq's fledgling democracy. He blew himself up in the parliament building inside the fortified Green Zone, killing 8 people. By mid-June, all 5 of the US's surge brigades had arrived in Baghdad. But their aim was no longer durable security.
Sustainable security is the term that's used. And sustainable means that, of course, you have a situation that can be carried forward by Iraqis, supported by Iraqis in the local community, with local community members completely involved and committed to it, supported, of course, by the Iraqi government.
Yet, whatever the Americans chose to call it, security was a long way off in Iraq.